Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Ferrer, your professor in Research and Social Studies. Today, we will be discussing topics on the related literature and studies. I would like to ask the group, what is related literature? Books have defined related literature as composed of discussions of facts and principles to which your research is related. Therefore, as you go on with your research, you have get a point to do some readings. You have to read sources to compose your related literature. So these materials are usually printed and can be found in books, encyclopedia, professional journals, magazines, newspapers, and other publications. This literature can be divided into two, those which are local and those which are foreign. When we say local literature, these are materials which are printed in the Philippines, while foreign literature are those which are printed in other lands. On the other hand, what is related studies? Books defined related studies as studies, inquiries, or observations which are already conducted and which you think are related to your present study. Those which have some bearing or some similarity to the problem you are investigating. There are 5 characteristics of related literature and studies. The first characteristic is literature in studies must be as recent as possible. When I say recent as possible, you will just count 5 years back. In the last 5 years, those literature and studies published related to your study can be considered as your sources. Except, of course, if you'll be citing laws, documents, or let's say the Constitution, of which you will be citing the most recent published laws or Constitution. Next is, it must be objective and unbiased. You have to make sure that your literature and studies are free from prejudices of the author or the writer, the researcher. For you to cite, you have to check it out whether the article is objective and unbiased. Another is, literature and studies must be relevant to your study. That is the reason why you are citing such literature or studies, because you find it relevant or important in your present investigation. Another is, it must be based upon genuinely original and true facts. So, as you read your literature and studies, then you have to determine, are these articles original? Are these articles true facts? Then, you can now cite those articles in your paper. And the next one is, must not be too few nor too many. As a writer, you have to determine whether you have enough literature and studies that can back up your investigation. Do not make a lengthy list of your literature and studies. It is advised that you have to choose only those literature and studies that is most relevant to your investigation. Remember, not too few nor too many. There are several sources of literature and studies that you can consult with as you write your paper. First, you can consult books, encyclopedia, almanacs, and other similar references. So, if you cannot visit the library due to the current situation, then you can check it out through the different websites for these sources. Another is articles published in professional journals, magazines and periodicals, newspapers, and the like. So it's very common for you to check on professional journals because studies are usually published in these journals and other periodicals. Third is, you can also consult manuscripts, monographs, memoirs, speeches, letters, and diaries which you think have some bearing to your problem. Another is unpublished theses and dissertations. You can visit libraries in the campus or libraries in the city or from other schools for their unpublished theses and dissertations. That these sources can give you recommendations which are beneficial in doing your related literature and studies. Next is the Constitution itself or other laws and statutes of the land, particularly if your research needs some legal basis. You have to consult these laws and statutes. You can also include some bulletins, circulars, and other memoranda emanating from government departments and offices. They are also good source of literature. And of course, records of the school or records from seminars and other official reports by government offices and the likes. Now, the next question is, what are the ways of citing related literature and studies? One is by topic. Example, it has been found out that praise is an important aid in the learning of children. That is according to Ferrer, 2012. So the citing of the literature is by topic. Another is by author or by writer. Example, according to Ferrer, 2012, research is. Okay, so that way of citing is by author or by writer. You can also cite chronologically. That is, the materials that you are citing may be presented according to the year they were written. And another is, when you cite more than 2 authors, you have to cite the surname of the first author and add it with the word et al. Example, in the study of Bye et al. 2001, it was revealed that, and when you cite 2 authors, you have to include the surnames of both authors. Example, according to Chambers and Conway 1992, livelihood comprises the capabilities of... Okay? So please remember those ways of citing related literature and studies. Now, the next question is, what to cite? In those bulk of literature and studies that you have read, what is that specific thing in there that you have to cite? So, in citing literature, it should be emphasized that only the major findings, ideas, generalizations, principles, and/or conclusions in related materials relevant to the problem under investigation should be discussed in the chapter. This is what we call meta-analysis. You have to avoid copying and pasting articles from your sources. That is not the correct way of citing literature. Meaning, you have to read those articles first, synthesized, and emphasize only what is needed to be emphasized. Next is your research assumption or assumptions. By the word itself, when you make an assumption, even though it is just an assumption, we usually base it to some evident truth. Meaning, when we do make assumptions, we should possess also some evidence of that assumption. Same true with research assumptions. It is a self-evident truth which is based upon a known fact or phenomena. So when you assume for your research, it should be evidence with or by with your literature and studies. But usually, in descriptive and historical researches, assumptions are not explicitly expressed, but they are being left implicitly. In short, they are unwritten. And some authors have published that assumptions in this kind of researches can already be found in the statement of the problem or the objectives of the study. So generally, as I said earlier, a specific question in your statement of the problem is implying already your assumption. Next is the conceptual framework. The conceptual framework actually is a scheme. It is a structure, the structure of your research. A tentative explanation or theoretical explanation of your problem. And usually, this serves as the basis in formulating your research hypothesis. Always remember that the conceptual framework is your own position on the problem. It is the researchers or the investigators' position or framework. After your exposure to various theories which you think have some bearing to your study, then you can now come up with your own framework. So, there's no need for you to use someone else's framework, but use those framework or principles as your basis, as your guide in formulating your own position, in formulating your own explanation to your investigation. So this is now your model, no? That is rooted on the previous models which other researchers have studied. So your framework is the central theme, or that is your focus, that is your main thrust, and that will serve as your guide in conducting your investigation or research. Next is the research hypothesis. It is a tentative conclusion or answer to the specific question that you have raised at the beginning of your investigation. So you have to go back to your statement of the problem. If you have stated there a question that needs to be answered through a research hypothesis, or a problem that speaks for a research hypothesis, then you have to include a research hypothesis. So as what I have mentioned earlier, this is a tentative conclusion or answer. In short, it is an educated guess about the answer to that specific question. So there are two forms of hypothesis. The operational form, or this is being stated in affirmative form or positive form. And the second is the negative form, or which is being stated negatively. So, operational form if it is affirmative, null form if it is negative. So, example, if your statement of the problem speaks for a significant relationship between two variables, when you state that in operational form, it should be stated there is a significant relationship. But in its null form, it should be stated as there is no significant relationship between these two variables. Okay? The next is the research paradigm or paradigm for others. This is defined as a diagrammatic representation of your conceptual framework. So after formulating your own framework or your own model for that study, you have to present it in a form of diagram, and we call that your research paradigm. So it shows in a more vivid way your conceptual framework, the thing that you want to convey to your reader. Okay? So please be reminded that the paradigm is a diagrammatic representation of the framework. Next is defining the terms that you use in your study. We usually encourage researchers to define terms they use in their study operationally, because there are two ways for you to define your terms. The first is the theoretical definition, or how such terms are defined in the dictionary, in books, and other sources. While operational definition is you define those terms depending on how you use that on your research. So, there are a few guidelines in defining the terms. One is, only terms, words, or phrases which have special or unique meaning in this study are defined. So usually, we define terms as used in your title or in your statement of the problem, because these are the terms or words or phrases that have a special meaning in your research. Second is, terms should be defined operationally. As I said earlier, that is how they are being used in your study. And number 3, the researcher may develop his own definition based from the characteristics of the terms defined. Another is, definition may be taken from books, magazines, and other sources. But if you use definition from the sources, you must acknowledge your sources. And definition must be brief, concise, clear, and unequivocal as possible. When I say brief and concise, just include what is most important in the term being defined. And unequivocal meaning it do not connote another meaning. And acronyms should always be spelled out fully. Sometimes we include acronyms in our writings. It is advised that you have to spell out fully. And last reminder, class, in writing your literature in studies, always remember to cite your sources. That is to avoid plagiarism. Please check your module, your work text for the application of the things that we have discussed for this